Hey, I'm Rafe, joined by Micah. This is our first interview for Your Boss Sucks, and joining us today is Ryan O'Leary from Metro DC DSA to discuss his recent success with proposing Initiative 82 in Washington, DC. Ryan, please take it away. Give us the elevator pitch of what exactly is Initiative 82.
So thank you guys, Rafe and Micah, for both having me. My name is Ryan O'Leary. Like you said, proposed Initiative 82, proud member of Metro DC DSA. And so what Initiative 82 did basically was it proposed to phase out the tipped minimum wage in DC, which is set to be about a third of the full minimum wage. It was around $5 or so when this was proposed. And it would phase it out over the course of, I guess it was 5 years till 2027, incrementally until it was at full parity with the full minimum wage. And this wouldn't eliminate tips. It would just mean that tips were truly tips. They were in addition to what your boss owes you for the minimum that your boss legally has to pay you for the work that you do.
Yeah. So many people may know that a few years back, Initiative 77 aimed to do basically the same thing as Initiative 82. And while it won the vote, it ultimately failed in the city council. Could you speak to this history of Initiative 77 and tie that into the new successful Initiative 82?
Yeah. So I want to say 2018, there was a similar, nearly identical initiative proposed that would have eliminated the tip minimum wage. It passed. So Initiative 82, the one that just took place last year, passed with 73, almost 74% of the vote. So pretty overwhelmingly. And Initiative 77 also passed back in 2018. It was a little closer. I think it may have been 56% voted yes, but still a pretty definitive majority. And in the aftermath of that, the National Restaurant Association, fondly known as the other NRA, the Business Lobbying Group for Restaurants, their local chapter in DC is called RAMW, the Restaurant Association of Metro Washington. And they went in full battle mode the moment that it passed, and they fought and lobbied the council, and the council ended up basically heeding them and their very sophisticated, I would call it an astroturfed operation. And they put I don't know the exact details, but the initiative went through some kind of like referenda where there had to be another election and vote on it again. And in order to get that referenda, all the signatures that needed to be collected to put it on the ballot the first time over months had to be collected in 1 week, and they were able to do it, but then through some
Wow.
technicality, uh, they weren't actually supposed to get 10 days, they were supposed to get 7, and so it got thrown out, and the council more or less overturned the will of the people. And so it's been a few years since then, or it had been back in 2022 when I started this, and or 2021, I guess actually. It was voted on in 2022, and yeah, it was time to put this to the ballot again. And I really think the people clearly spoke this time, and the council has been very good, and they haven't screwed around with it yet.
Well, let's hope that that stays the case. What do you think activists on the ground can learn in hindsight from Initiative 77 being obstructed by the DC City Council? And what do you think Initiative 82 did better as a more effective ballot initiative campaign? And specifically in relation to the other 7 states where we've had a similar policy be passed, uh, what can activists on the ground learn about that or learn from that or in those
Yeah.
areas?
Yeah, so there's a lot of history to that. So I can't speak directly on what Initiative 82 did better than Initiative 77. I wasn't involved in the 77 campaign, so I don't want to say that necessarily. And then also, it's hard to use the other 7 states as comparisons simply because most of those had they made the change decades ago, or they never made the change. They just always paid everybody the full minimum wage plus tips.
Wow. Okay.
And so there's a little bit of a this is really kind of like a first of its kind case. They tried to also pass this in Portland, Maine, in 2022 as well. So just in the city of Portland. Unfortunately, that failed at the ballot box. Chicago just recently passed this into law as well, but that was done through like normal, alderman, like a normal vote in the Chicago City Council. And there's efforts to do it now in other places too. They're trying to get something rolling in Ohio and in Maryland, and I believe Massachusetts. And there's been a long-term effort in New York State to get Kathy Hochul to just enact this into law, because for New York, for whatever reason, it seems similar to like student debt in that it's an executive order that can just make it happen. And so there's been efforts there as well. But what I can say, at least towards why I think Initiative 82 was a very big success, I think that one of the biggest things is what didn't happen, which was a very strong anti or no campaign that Initiative 77 had to deal with. There was a very well-funded campaign in 2018 called Save Our Tips, which was run by the Restaurant Association, and they really scared the hell out of a lot of the tipped workers in DC, and especially the higher earning ones, that this was going to eliminate tipping and that they would effectively be taking a pay cut. And so there was a very, very strong group, very loud group in 2018 of tipped workers who were strongly against this. And it's, from what I've heard and from what I've learned from people who were involved, it was just a bloodbath. I mean, it was just a very dirty campaign. No one came out of it very happy with how it went. There was a lot of just, words being thrown around and names being called. And that still existed in a very small corner of the DC political world, for Initiative 82. But it was clear that the Restaurant Association, and they said so much themselves, like they knew that this was going to pass and that there wasn't really a point to launching a very, intense, campaign against it. It was more to try to, they just wanted to try to keep things from getting any worse than they probably would already going to happen to, in their minds, to their industry members. So I do think that that was really important. I also think something that we did that was very helpful was just, working in coalition, especially with, contrary to what some people seem to think, I was not running for office. I was just managing a ballot initiative. And so with that, it's kind of, its ownership on paper may have been mine, but it didn't really function that way because, I no longer work in the industry. And once this passes, I mean, it passes with the support of everyone, and it's out of my hands. Once it passes, then it's done. And so I spent a lot of time really trying to form a strong coalition of all of the organizations in DC and people who support this initiative and wanted to do work on it. And instead of trying to act as a centralized hub for that stuff that a lot of political candidates or campaigns are, which, not saying it's bad or good for them, I think it makes sense, but for this, just letting people do their own thing, whether it be, DSA wanted to print their own lit and make their own walk lists and do their own stuff, and I just let them do it. We were a very small campaign. It was just me, my treasurer, and a few others who were, we were all being, either not being paid at all to do it or being paid through some other job to do it. And so we didn't have a ton of capacity. And so, DSA doing that work, DC for Democracy canvassing for it along with their endorsed electeds, Jews United for Justice as well, the Metro Labor Board of AFL-CIO in DC, and a lot of elected officials as well. And so I spent a lot of time just trying to get as many people on board as possible, as many groups on board, and let them kind of do what they liked. And I think it worked out very well.
Yeah, so it sounds like this process is highly variable depending on where you live. But I think a lot of people are still curious about how a person who represents the workers and not some wealthy interest can get legislation like this on the ballot. Can you give us a bit of a crash course in this process?
A lot of help. So I originally took on this project as part of an organizing role I had with a nonprofit group. And so that allowed me. So first thing I will say is a ballot initiative is, and we probably have, other than California, some of the least restrictive ballot initiative laws in the country. I mean, they can get very, very pedantic. Like there's some northwestern state, maybe Montana or one of the Dakotas, like the entire law needs to be printed on a single piece of paper on the petition collection sheets to get it on the ballot. And so if it's a very long law, like literally the piece of paper is like this big. And it's like these kinds of dumb rules because like state governments do not like ballot initiatives. They don't like being having their hand forced through direct democracy. And so it's purposely not meant to be easy to just, play legislator on the ballot in the US. But and so for that reason, I say, like, if you have an idea and you really think you want this to become law and you're thinking about doing a ballot initiative, like, do not do a ballot initiative. Like, talk to your local electeds, form a coalition group, like, lobby them. Like, we got voting rights for migrants in DC and undocumented or non-citizens in DC for DC local elections. Like, that did not require a ballot initiative. It just required consistent, regular effort and coalition building and relationship building and organizing at the council level. And it didn't cost much money. Now, to get a ballot initiative on the ballot, realistically, it'll cost you like $250,000 probably with room when that's giving you like a little bit of like room to spare. Because it's going to cost you about $100,000 to collect the signatures. You have to collect 5% of all registered voters' signatures in DC to get on the ballot. And they have to come from, and including 5% of voters from 5 of the 8 wards. So you can't just have like 20% of voters in Ward 1 sign the petition and get on the ballot. It needs to be like relatively spread out. And you can't do that without paying people. Like it's the quality. I mean, just think about this, the way that people move around DC and come in and out of the city, and the fact that we are a city. So the majority of people you run into, especially in the high foot traffic areas, don't live in DC. On top of that, people move a lot. And if they put down the wrong voting address, they put down their current address and not the one that they voted at, that's not valid because that doesn't match up in the voter roll system. If their name is illegible or you can't, spell it out right to find somebody in the voter roll. And so you need to pay people per signature to make sure that this works really well. Per valid signature is how we did it. And we were really generous. We paid like $7 per valid signature. And so if you were, I mean, some people made out like bandits, like, pro ballot, like petition collectors. And a lot of the city council campaigns kind of got peeved at us because then everyone was demanding $7 per valid signature and they wanted to like, go back to like the $5 or $2, whatever they're doing. So we paid a lot, especially, but also we paid that much because it was COVID in the middle of the winter. It was the biggest spike in COVID in DC. It was the winter. It seemed almost like an impossible feat to us because at the end of the day, you need like 25,000 valid signatures. Luckily, we had the COVID tests were coming out of the government was releasing COVID tests, and you had to pick them up at a DC library, and you had to show your DC driver's license or ID card in order to get them. So you had to be a DC resident, and there were just these long lines outside of every library of just DC residents that you could just go down and get them all to sign up for it. So that was a huge help for us. If that didn't exist, I don't know if we would have gotten on the ballot. So after you spend $100K on collecting signatures, and again, that didn't get us all the signatures. Like, I mean, DSA got us a huge amount, and that was volunteer work. All my signatures were not being paid. I wasn't double dipping. After that, you can expect lawsuits, and so lawsuits are where the other $100K would go, and then I'm thinking $50K just for everything else. And of course, this involves no one being paid a salary or any kind of wage other than just petition collectors. So it's very expensive. It's very difficult. There's lots of things you have to know how to do. I mean, even just like going through the steps of filing appropriately with the Board of Elections, and there's like a lot of chicken and egg moments where like in order to form your campaign committee, you have to have a bank account, but in order to open a bank account, under your campaign committee's name. It has to be formed. And so you get into these like weird situations where both things need to happen before the other thing can happen, and you have to work out solutions. People will challenge your ballot signatures, and then you'll have to go to the Board of Elections and sit behind people as they check every signature, and you challenge their challenges and stuff like that. So it's a very long process. Suffice to say, it's very expensive, and there's no guarantee that you'll even get on the ballot. And if you get on the ballot, there's no guarantee that you're going to pass. And again, this is all without there being a strong opposition campaign either. So, add more money to that, the stronger there is an opposition campaign, I guess.
Wow. So it takes even $250,000 to try and start a ballot initiative campaign like this. And that's despite not having to confront a Save Our Tips Initiative 77 style restaurant lobby AstroTurf campaign. So with that, you now have Initiative 82 on the ballot. You have people are willing to canvass and door knock. So my question for you is, what parts of DC were most responsive to Initiative 82 and most supportive? Why would you say that those communities were most responsive? And what lessons does that teach about grassroots activism in general in terms of reaching out to specific communities that would resonate with progressive priorities?
Yeah. Well, again, we were really lucky in that all areas responded positively to this initiative. There was no place in DC that voted against it. I have a map literally right above my desk showing the results. So, like, the Palisades, I think we're closer to like 52-48. That might have been like the lowest win margin that we had. And then across the river in Ward 7 and 8, it was like a complete blowout. It was like there were some precincts with like 90% yes. And then Ward 3 and Ward 1 were very strong as well. And so it's kind of what you would expect. Like everywhere voted yes, but the places that voted yes by lower margins were Ward 3, Ward 2, and Ward 6, with Wards 1, 4, 5, 7, and 8 voting more strongly yes. Wards 3, 7, and 8 are much easier to canvass because they have homes with their own doors and doorbells, and I think especially in Ward 7 and 8, there's just a lot more willingness to answer the door as well compared to in the rest of the city. But also, I mean, people, the average income in Ward 7 and 8, for those who don't know, is significantly lower than the rest of DC. It's more residential, but also just has a much higher rate of poverty and worse, education, graduation rates, all of those things. And so it can be understood that there's probably a lot more people working in the service industry there. I think it's something like 50% or more of people who work tipped wage jobs are very income insecure. You're paid on a daily basis usually, and your pay can vary wildly depending on the week or your schedule or just how busy it is, the season. And, I don't think a lot of people in Ward 3, I think most of the restaurants are in Ward 2 and 3 and 6, but not a lot of the restaurant workers necessarily. And so I think that may have influenced it as well. A lot of people in those districts may know restaurant owners and not restaurant workers. But yeah, no, I mean, I definitely think it's just understandable that, the DC used to be defined as like east or west of the river. And I feel like it's now kind of defined as like east of the river or east of the park, being Rock Creek Park. Like, there's kind of three divisions forming: a more multiracial, diverse, densely urban kind of center part of the city that is just more left leaning. And then you have honestly a more conservative and more Black and lower income east of the river. And then you have the more white and wealthy, west of the park kind of area. And so I think you started to see more of that as well, with this election.
Yeah,
And
it's very
shout out to
interesting.
Ben Davis, fellow DSA member, for coming up with that theory. You can read all about it in the DSA magazine.
So I'm sure after Initiative 77, you guys learned a lot and you guys honed your tactics a lot. But I'm also sure that the restaurant lobby honed their tactics a lot. You mentioned that the fight for Initiative 77 was a lot dirtier in terms of how the restaurant lobby fought. And I'm curious if they honed any of those tactics. I'm curious what their most effective tactics were and how you guys effectively fought back and uh, essentially won the fight.
Yeah. So I don't think anyone was really dirty. Well, any organization was necessarily like mudslinging or anything. I think we both ran very clean campaigns. I did um a kind of roundtable with the leader of the No 182 campaign, which was just called No 182. It wasn't called Save Our Tips or anything. But and he's actually also my former employer. I worked for him when I was at AU as a student. And then we had he brought a anti 82 tipped worker. I invited a pro 82 tipped worker, and we kind of talked it out. it, and even that got kind of dirty, but not between us. It was audience members. Like, people, especially tipped workers, have very strong feelings about this. It seems like, and if you're against this, it really feels like you're lacking a certain amount of agency in your jobs, like the career that you've entered into. And that's really, I think, a key point, is that the number of career high earning bartenders in DC is a very small group. I knew a lot of them when I worked in the industry as well. And when you make, I mean, let me see real quick. I'm gonna do the math. $5.20 times 40 times 52 equals $10,800. So if you're working full time and not making any, so like, it costs an employer $10,800 to employ a bartender. And a tip worker never works 40 hours a week. It's some days, some weeks you work 60 hours, some weeks you work 12. Your shifts don't have end times. They just have like general, eventually you're just cut and you have to finish all the work you do in the tables that you have. And who knows when you actually get out of there. And so if you're making, and these bartenders are making sometimes, up to $90,000 to $100,000 a year. And so when 90% of your income comes through tips and you're being told that those might go down, decrease, or go away, it's horrifying. Now, and I feel for them on that. My bigger issue, though, is that the majority of tipped workers, the vast majority, are not them. Even not just saying high earning bartenders in general are a minority of the tipped working industry. There are far more servers and far more bussers and food runners and barbacks that do not come close to making that much money every year, who live very insecure lives, especially when you talk about like help staff, like bussers, the people who clean the tables, food runners, the people who bring the food to the tables, and barbacks who assist bartenders. They also get tipped out from your servers and bartenders' tips. So not only are your servers and bartenders not keeping all the tips that you give them, but part of them are going to other tipped workers who are making far less than the servers and bartenders at the end of the day. And when you talk to these people, there was no question that they supported this. And so while I do feel for, higher end bartenders maybe losing 5-10K or making that much less per year, I, compared to the increase in income that all these other workers are getting, I think it's worth the exchange. But we both came out with videos. DSA came out with videos from pro tipped workers. The argument still centered around, do tipped workers want this? And so the people speaking on both sides were usually tipped workers saying I do or I don't, which confused voters a lot. But I mean, or it seemed to, but it seems to not have confused them too much. Most of them did vote on it, vote yes. But yeah, it was just a matter of, what's going to happen. And I think there's plenty of evidence, a lot of it done by the Economic Policies Institute, as well as other organizations that have done real peer-reviewed research on this topic. And so there were just always there's clear evidence on what would happen for our arguments, but there was nothing more than just like, this is going to be terrible. Every business is going to close. Everyone's going to lose their jobs. Like, it was just like, the house is on fire stuff with nothing to back it up because, as much as they can say that this hasn't been done recently or in the past few decades, we don't know what will happen. The same can be said for them. And so, yeah. And I think that so far it's been a little over a year. And the sky hasn't fallen. And if you talk to tip workers, a lot of them that I've spoken to say they're making the same or more money. And again, that's only after a $3 increase.
Yeah. So in terms of the propaganda almost put out by the restaurant lobby, it sounds like they love to point to individual cases of workers, which is, I would say, very characteristic of these capitalist organizations. So I would love if you could speak to a more structural critique of the role of tipping in DC. I know there's been a lot said about the history of it, and I don't know how much you'd like to go into that, but take that wherever you'd like and speak to your structural critique of this situation and how you guys effectively um, spoke to the public on that issue.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Take that wherever you want to.
Yeah, so I won't get into like the origins of American tipping. I find that point to be quite belabored, and also I don't think I'm the person to kind of make that just teach that lesson. But it's been around forever. The tipped minimum wage has not federally hasn't changed since I was born in 1991. It's sat at $2.30. Um, I there's a fact that I think the Department of Labor determined that at any given time, like or 1 out of 5 restaurants is committing wage theft or fraud or violating Department of Labor standards. It's an incredibly easy kind of business to start. And so I don't think that, and there's just so few protections on the day to day. And there's a reason why, because I mean, you could argue it's not unionized very heavily. And then you can ask, why isn't it unionized heavily? Because it's practically impossible to unionize restaurant workers. The entire industry, the way it's set up and the way that tips are incentivized and the way that they're looked at leads the workplace to be a like hyper individualistic place in a restaurant. If I make $100 in tips and you make $50 in tips, I am twice as good at my job as you are. It's just like how it works in a lot of people's heads. It's all about them. They want the good tables. Screw you. I got mine, screw you and yours kind of, attitudes. And so if you're making good money, and even if your, coworkers are having trouble, they are being harassed by the boss, the idea of there being like a walk on the boss by everybody at a restaurant, or even like a walkout 1 hour strike at the height of, lunch rush or something, it's just not going to happen. There's always going to be people who, at the end of the day, are desperate for the money and are just like, that's a you problem. I want to make money. If you're all out there, there'll be more tables for me to make money off of in here. Like it truly is a very difficult industry in that way. And when you see like unionized restaurants, most of them are in hotels, in casinos, places that are heavily unionized. And so those end up getting kind of rolled into that same industry. Like, even though Nevada's right to work, it is one of the highest union densities in the country simply because of Las Vegas and Reno and the casino and hotel industry. And so, and it's right to work, so which is really crazy. But yeah, there's definitely a structural critique to be made. At the same time, in Europe, restaurant workers have far lower living standards and wage standards at the end of the day without tips. But they also have, there's the housing and the healthcare and the other things to consider as well.
Could you please elaborate on the distribution of tips on various demographics of different service workers within the tipped service worker industry within DC? Because one of the most interesting facts and figures that I saw on DSA literature about Initiative 82 was essentially this idea that white men disproportionately receive way more tips than people of color, minorities, women, and historically marginalized people that are now working within the DC service industry.
Definitely hasn't been a survey done. And honestly, I wouldn't even say of like the handful of very outspoken anti-82 tips workers, there wasn't a specific demographic that seemed to stick out. But I mean, of course, white guys make more than everybody else. You're entrusting the customer to basically pay your employees' wages, and customers can just discriminate on like on an individual basis, and they will. They will. I mean, white men like myself are going to make more than everybody else. Oh my God, what if you're trans and they keep misgendering you, and you correct them once, but you don't want to correct them again, or maybe you don't want to correct them at all because you're worried about your tip? What if a customer like comes on to you and you're a woman and you feel like you can't, tell them to fuck off. You have to actually just be like, ah, ha, ha, ha. And like, it's miserable. Wearing masks, being told, take your mask off so I can see how much I should tip you, sweetie, and that kind of thing. And then there's just like the classic, like, I don't like, uh, I don't know, black people, or I don't like gay people, and I have like a really gay waiter, and so I'm just not going to tip him very well because I mean, it's just I don't understand it, but it seems to me almost you don't need to do a study on that. You just know it must be happening.
Could you speak to ongoing efforts to stomp down on wage theft, dynamic scheduling, and other obstacles or barriers that DC service workers have to deal with to just enjoy a decent living? Because you know, as you know, some weeks if you're a service work in DC, you get a paycheck for a couple $100. In other weeks, you have paychecks of over $1,000 a week, and navigating that budgeting must be very difficult. So, could you speak to ongoing efforts to stomp down on wage theft and dynamic scheduling, please?
Yeah. So at the end of the day, there's certain industries that just have to function this way to a certain extent. Like you just can't have the same shifts every day, every week, every year. It's similar to like the construction industry. Some days, sometimes you just don't have. There's no construction to do, and so you can't, lay brick or something like that. But um, the bigger issue, so there's seasonal changes. For instance, like in DC, uh, August and January are absolutely dead, and then November, December, and then cherry blossom season. So like March, April are very, very busy. And then you have tourist season kind of in May, June. And then the rest is kind of just, normal, I guess you could say. And so staffing changes because of that. And then also, there's a lot of you a restaurant can only book or schedule shifts based off how many reservations they have and how many walk-ins they think they're going to get. And so plenty of times you get to work and you sit around for an hour and a half. You wait on one person and they order a cup of coffee and don't tip you. And then you get cut, meaning that you're done. Don't take any more tables. So now you have to polish silverware. Now you have to clean glasses. And now you have to, I don't know, clean the soda machine or something like that before you can go home and tip everybody out and everything like that. And you were paid, in most states like Virginia, $2.30 an hour for that, 3 hours of work you just did, and you got no tips. Now, there's meant to be like things put in place to stop that from being your wage, but it generally doesn't happen. It's basically over a pay period, you need to average to the full minimum wage according to federal law. So you can end up working, a few terrible shifts during the middle of the week and then make, $40 an hour on Saturday night where you closed and didn't get out till 2 in the morning. And so that averages out to above the minimum wage. So your employer doesn't owe you anything. But it's very annoying to have to come into shifts and to not be able to work. And also it's difficult when you do have a really great week and you got, really good shifts. You're doing a lot of dinners, where things cost more and people eat more, and more importantly, people drink, which raises the price of a bill. And so you make, $1,500 in a week, and then you live like you're going to do that next week, and you only get 3 lunch shifts. And so now even when you are making good amounts of money from tips work, it always does feel kind of hand to mouth and paycheck to paycheck, because it's difficult to without some serious like saving and budgeting and creating a budget for yourself on a weekly basis, which I guess isn't that hard to do, but you end up always being out of money, because you never know how much you're going to make next week, and you spend like you're going to make what you made last week, and it kind of screws everything up. And also, if
Yep.
you piss off your manager, they can just take away your shifts, and so now you're poor. You know.
Yeah. So could you speak more to the future of unionizing the restaurant industry in DC and just talk about the fight for workers' rights in DC more broadly?
Yeah. Well, we do have a few really high grossing chains, I guess you could call them, like Clyde's. Clyde's also owns Old Ebbitt Grill, the Tombs, Hamilton, where I used to work, and fancy place out in Georgetown. I can't remember the name. But they're some of the highest grossing restaurants in the country. They're a very large group, and importantly, they have a lot of employees that could fall under the union contract. And I think something that a lot of workers are realizing at this point, with everyone so hyped to unionize, is that like unions, it costs a lot for them to invest in unionizing you, and if you aren't very big of a bargaining unit, they're probably just going to say, "Nah." It's go after big fish are the easiest to unionize, and so I think there are opportunities for that to happen. I definitely imagine there are plenty of restaurants in hotels that aren't part of the bargaining contracts yet. I know we do have a very strong Unite Here chapter in DC or local that could really help out with that kind of stuff. Um, but then I also think because of the nature of restaurants and how few employees they all have, well, I should backtrack on that for a second because there's a lot of restaurant groups in DC. Like they don't all look like Clyde's where they all kind of have the same vibe and the same branding. They're just a whole bunch of concepts that are all part of like this, like owned by 3 people and they're 10 investors. And so there a lot of these like one-off places you think are one-off are not. They're part of bigger groups. But even in the case where they aren't, I think that doing things through legislation like we've done in DC are really helpful, and can provide a lot of relief that unions can provide, but through legislation like the paid family leave bill, the guaranteed sick days that you get, albeit not many, but I think that's important. You could even mandate vacation time if you wanted to. Another thing I think is really interesting is a public pension fund for certain groups of employees. So whether that be restaurant workers and custodial staff, or kind of like the groups, the workers that keep the city running and that we need in order to allow all of the people with nice things to live here and buy more nice things. And so we need both of these groups of people. We need people who create the tax dollars that fund our city. And we also need the people who make the food and clean the movie theaters and the bathrooms that we all want to use. And so I think a public pension fund would be a really good idea. Create some kind of retirement account because, like I said, it's very hand to mouth, and there's no 401k option. And if there is, they don't match it. It's just a tax-free account for you to just like put some money away into. Um, and you work yourself to death. Like you really are, like honestly, it's very difficult to continue working as a server or a bartender, like until retirement age. You really destroy your body. And that's I'm not even getting started on back of house like chefs and dishwashers and stuff where like it's very difficult for them. And so there should be some kind of safety net that allows these people to continue to do these jobs and feel like they're not going to have to basically try to live a life that allows them to die at 65 because they won't be able to afford retirement.
Yeah, so jumping off that last question, I'm curious about how students and young people like ourselves can help out in this fight for workers' rights in DC and just around the country. So I know there's several fights going on in DC right now, and I'm curious which ones you'd like to plug and how we can get involved.
Yeah, so there is a group that is kind of formed, a coalition, I should say, post 82's passing, called the let me look this up real quick. I'm in the Slack group. But it's National Women's Law Center, Jobs with Justice is taking a very big role. DSA is also a part of it. And they're basically trying to make sure that, this ends up becoming law the way it was written on the ballot. Fair Price, Fair Wage Coalition. So there have been some efforts by certain council members to introduce legislation that I think would adversely affect the nature or the goals of Initiative 82. Kenyon McDuffie had introduced, I think it was called the RAP Act, which would have more or less and we haven't even talked about this yet, mandated service fees. It wouldn't have mandated it, but it would have created a situation where every single restaurant would end up charging exorbitant service fees and service charges, which we've already seen kind of happen. And it would have done a few other things. Like basically, the idea is, I service charges are bad because it literally negates the entire purpose of 82. Like tips are good, but not when they cover part of your wage, because it leads to rampant amounts of wage theft and fraud in the restaurant industry, because your employer doesn't owe you the same wage for every hour that you work. And service charges in lieu of a tip make it even worse than that, because now the tips aren't even going to you first, they're going to your employer in the form of a service charge, and your employer is just saying, don't worry, trust me, I'm going to give you the right amounts that you are owed. And there's been cases that I've seen where when they actually did the math and crunched the numbers, bartenders realized they were only getting 10% of the 20% service charge, and so it's really, really dangerous in my opinion. And I would really, I'm really excited that the FTC is considering banning service charges nationally for everything. That would be awesome, because you just need to raise prices. This is how conservative astrology economics works. Like just it costs more. Okay, then make more money. Yeah, and so there's a group now that's working with that. I'd also encourage you to join DSA if you're trying to get involved in workers' rights. Our biggest and I think our most effective, one of our biggest and most effective coalitions that we have in our chapter is the Labor Coalition. I think it does really good work, and it does the right kind of work where it is there to support and basically offer aid to workers and labor unions when they need it. I work for a labor union now, and every time I go to a major city where I know there's a strong DSA chapter, I ask the local, like, how often do you interact with DSA? And they're like, who? And I'm like, do you have a picket right now? Do you need people to be at that picket? Workers not, they're not enough work. Okay, you can just call them, and 5 of them will just show up and just say, what do you want me to do? And that is really a really big help, I think, to the labor movement. Definitely don't, if you are going to get involved in the labor movement, I would suggest to do just that and to not offer suggestions or critiques to what labor is doing, as some lefties like to do. And then there's also, well, yeah, so there's the Fair Price, Fair Wage Coalition. There's DSA. I encourage you to learn more about what unions are on your campus and what groups are and aren't unionized. There's a lot of unions doing really great work right now on unionizing university staff. You have SEIU. You have UAW doing a lot of that as well, and the Teamsters. So, there's a lot of really big, high-powered, labor going around trying to unionize these, whether it be, janitors, grad students, cafeteria workers, research fellows, TAs, anything like that, RAs. I would definitely, if those things are on your campus, I would get involved any way I can.
Also, gotta plug our local campus union, SCU 500. AU is strike ready.
Yeah,
Okay.
and people who are trying to unionize, or I'm telling you, I'm sure if you complimented, the lady who swipes your card to get into the dining hall on her strike ready shirt, she didn't swipe your card to get into the dining hall. A pro tip, if you never want to pay for a drink on an airplane, fly American Airlines and just compliment their strike ready lanyards. You'll never pay for another Bloody Mary again. But yeah, no, absolutely. Love
Okay.
SEIU, love my alma mater.